we look together at Psalm 116, which traditionally is part of our chanting on Pesach. Actually, as part of our chanting on Pesach, we're only chanting on this, the third day of Pesach. We're only doing the second half of the psalm. And I'll circle back and talk about why on Rosh Chodesh and the last 6 days of Passover, Psalm 115 and 116, we only chant the last half. But this psalm kind of flows with a order of the Psalms. So a little bit of a review to put Psalm 116 into context. And that is, Psalms are verses 113 to 118. And in having that order, there's a sense of flow. And so here's a little bit just to put it into context. 113, you may recall, was the psalm that dealt with God cares even for those who are the lowest. In that sense, the sense of God who is above, reaching below, which led to Psalm 114, B'tzeit Yisrael Mitzrayim, when we went out from Egypt, the sense that God saw us and did wonders for us as a people, with 114 summarizing some of the miracles of first going out from Egypt, but leading us to Mount Sinai and providing us water in the desert. And then Psalm 115 was a focus on a different kind of slavery, that of idolatry, and how a belief in God is a God who is not seen but powerful, in contrast to the things that were crafted by human hands, seen but impotent. And now Psalm 116 shifts from the national and from the statements of God in the larger scope to a deeply personal psalm. 35 times in this psalm of 19 verses, the word I or me is said 35 times. And yet, the focus of the psalm is testimony. The psalmist brings a personal story. We're not quite sure what it's about. In fact, the feel of Psalm 116 is of incompleteness due to gushing. There are, even from the very first word you will see in a moment, there's a sense of ellipses, of gaps, as if this psalmist, celebrating God's goodness to him, he is so eager to let everybody know about God's goodness that he's tripping over his words, leaving out words. There's a quality of enthusiasm as the psalmist wishes to testify, to bear witness to others, and to do so in public space of God's goodness. So in that sense, there's a flow from kind of the more philosophic pieces about who is God, to the national liberation, now to the personal. And with that, let me put up Psalm 116. And as is our normal course, I will read it through to get a feel for the flow. I will again point out that verses 1 to 11 is recited at our seder. The whole psalm, all 19 verses, is part of our seder part of Hallel. But on Rosh Chodesh, a new month, and on the last 6 days of Passover, verses 1 to 11 are not chanted, almost to make a distinction between the holiest time and not so. Though the rabbis will comment on Sukkot, we read all of Psalms each day. And one explanation will be, as it gets discussed in the Talmud, is that in the time of the temple, there were special offerings brought each day of Sukkot, but not for Pesach, just on the first day and the last day. So hence, this Psalm 116, like 115, is a sign of the distinction between the most holy and Chol HaMoed, which is this hybrid of the secular and the sacred. I entitled this from one of the verses that I will focus in on, from verse 16, "For I am your servant." Psalm 116. I love. For Adonai hears my voice and my pleas for grace. For God incline God's ear to me, and throughout my days I will call out. Encircled by cords of death, the straits of Sheol have found me. Trouble and sorrow I find. And with the name of Adonai I will call out. Please, Adonai, save my soul. Anna Adonai, malta nafshi. Gracious is Adonai and just. Our God is compassionate. Guardian of the simple is Adonai. I was brought low, and God delivered me. Return, my soul, to your calm, for Adonai has dealt graciously, generously with you. You saved my soul from death, my eye from a tear, my foot from stumbling. I will walk before Adonai in the lands of the living. I believed, for I spoke. Anna aniti me'od, I am afflicted greatly. I said in my rashness, Kol ha'adam kozev, each mortal is deceitful. What can I return back to Adonai? All God's generosity to me. The cup of deliverance I will lift up, and in the name of Adonai I will call out. Uveshem Adonai ekra. My vows to Adonai I will complete in the presence surely of all God's people. Precious in the eyes of Adonai is the death of God's pious ones. Please, Adonai, for I am your servant. I am your servant, the son of your handmaid. You have opened my straps. To you I will offer a sacrifice of thanksgiving, and upon the name of Adonai I will call out. My vows to Adonai I will complete in the presence surely of all God's people, in the courtyards of the house of Adonai, in your midst of Jerusalem. Hallelujah. Now, it's the natural way of our traditional commentators to try and find a person and a time to, if you will, concretize the context of a psalm. And this psalm is identified by many of the traditional commentators as written by King David. For King David had so much suffering of all kinds, and here in the psalm we're not told what the suffering is, whether these cords of death here in verse 3 are physical illness or enemies. But in those traditional commentators, like in the Art Scroll, a compilation, an anthology of traditional commentary, this psalm is identified in the Art Scroll with King David after learning of the death of King Saul, who had pursued him, and David reflecting on the dangers he had experienced and thanking God for now being able to breathe out, no longer endangered by King Saul. Of course, that's not clearly the case. In fact, one of the things that goes against that for Bible commentaries is the repeated use of Aramaic. So these forms, like in verse 7, Shuvi nafshi lim nuchaichi, return my soul to your calm. The chi at the end, or in verse 7, the last word, alaichi, with you. The E sound, being you, is Aramaic. And Aramaic tends not to have entered into the Hebrew until after the Babylonian exile. Not necessarily, but largely. So the book of Daniel will be a book of the Bible with much Aramaic. That Aramaic is also part of the close in verse 12, that same kind of ending, tagmulohi, you get it betochechi, so the midst, your midst. So that's long after King David when Aramaic comes in. So when the traditional rabbis are making that link, it's not necessarily based on the language, it's based on a natural desire to kind of concretize. So from the beginning, ahavti, I love, or I loved. Either way, again, this is perfect grammatical tense. Remember, there's only two in Hebrew. It can be past or present, but it's an ellipsis, which I mark with a comma. It doesn't say what the person, it doesn't say, I love Adonai. It doesn't, right? So there's a direct object missing. In that sense, you get already the feeling from the very beginning of Psalm 116 of gratitude, of love, but also incompleteness, a quality of gushing. And the I love, of course, as is all the more the nature of Hebrew, can be multifaceted. So in the Talmud, Psachim 118b, Rava, 3rd century Babylonia, he will quote this verse and say, I am loved when I am loved by you, God, when you hear the song, the sound of my prayer. So, I love you, Adonai, for you, Adonai, hear my voice. That's one possibility. This also could mean, and that Ibn Ezra, the biblical commentator, uses the understanding of the Talmud of Psachim 118b. Malbim, a later commentator, Russia, will say, I love supplications. I love, being able to speak my longings. In the Talmud, Rosh Hashanah 17a, the school of Hillel, Beit Hillel says, what is it that the psalmist loves? Quoting this opening verse, I love that God tilts the scales for the average person, the Benoni, who the Benoni, by the way, is going to be very much part of my presentation tomorrow on the Lubavitcher Rebbe and the Tanya. So this concept of the Benoni is in Rosh Hashanah, where they say, the regarding Rosh Hashanah and God looking at the scales, that when a person is totally righteous, they are honored. When they're wicked, they're condemned. But most people are being judged because they are Benoni, in the middle. And in that description of Beit Hillel, they'll link this to verse 6. What is it I love? That the guardian of the simple is Adonai. I was brought low, and God delivered me. So I love the fact that God is kind. So back to the very beginning. The psalm begins with the word heartfelt. With the I, this will be personal, and incomplete. Fill in the blank. And we'll get that repeatedly. So get one more example of that, and it's almost the same kind of structure. Verse 10, He'emanti, I believed. Believed what? Believed why? We're not told what the I believed is in reference to. For I spoke. Maybe because I had faith, I could call out to God. I believed that God was gracious. But again, uncertain. So that's the feel. There are these strong personal statements and gaps. All right. In verses 1 and 2, you get 5 words in verses 1 and 2 about listening, speaking, and yet there's a sense of more than one audience, meaning the audience could be God, or it could be to proclaim God to others. So God, Yishma, listened, voice, plea, ear, call. 5 words in verses 1 and 2 that also sets the tone of what's to follow. Namely, this is about proclaiming that God listens and has responded. Verse 3 is a touch of what was the problem, but we're not sure what it was. Encircled by cords of death. Chevle Mavet. Rashi and the Targum, the Aramaic translation, will see this as bands, instead of cords, bands of murderers. But it could also be, again, King David or somebody else with other kinds of enemies, or it can be illness, as we will see. And with the name of Adonai, verse 4, I will call out, Anna Adonai malta nafshi, please Adonai, save my soul. And this word Anna, which will also be spelled in 119, Psalm 119 with an aleph, can mean please. It can mean simply accentuating a word. So it can mean Anna, as Art Scroll will say, fervent pleading. Save my soul. And again, the feeling at the beginning is that God is there to listen when we need to call out. 4, and now verse 5, such is the nature of God, echoing God's self-description of Exodus 34:6. 3 qualities. Gracious, which means giving even when unmerited, balanced with just, and when those are combined, compassion. We are now in the second day of the Omer. Today is Gevorah, Shel Chesed. Those are 2 of the qualities of God that we are honoring. Gevorah means just or restrained. Chesed is kindness. And when those two get blended, the third sphira, which will be tonight and tomorrow in the foreground, that's called tiferet, compassion. So gracious is undeserved love. Tzedek, din. Gevorah is strict justice. When those are in balance, you get compassion, a wise giving. Guardian of the simple is Adonai. This word, pitayim, is a rare word. We get it in two other places where in Psalms it is the pitayim, which is simple. It can also be understood as naive or protectionless. The verb lipateh can mean to seduce. So a way to think of the simple in verse 6 is it's those who are naive and easily seduced. Remember, I linked it earlier with that statement of it is God who is caring for the simple. That can be a statement here of humility. I was brought low and God delivered me. And the implication there also is that he might have, because he was naive, it might be naive in terms of the lack of scruples of other people, he allowed himself to become low. Malbim, again, that popular translator, commentator of Russia, 18th, 19th century, will say, I was brought low by not doing mitzvot. Verse 7 is now the agitated psalmist talking to himself, to his soul, his inner being. Shuvi nafshi limnuchaychi. Return my soul to your calm. Menucha can be rest, comfort. Ki Adonai gamal alaychi. For Adonai has dealt gamal, gemilut chasadim, generously, graciously, beneficently with you. So you are feeling low. You have allowed yourself to be a simpleton, to have been naive. Be calm. God is gamal. Gemilut chasadim is the acts of kindness, not necessarily linked to money, that a person does to another. And there's a beautiful piece in the Talmud about Gimel as gamal, as graciousness, and Daled as the lowly. And in playing with that, a Gimel is, pointing forward, and the Daled has like a back. And it's the Gimel is reaching out, think of a Gimel, toward the Daled, who is the poor, who has no need to look back to see who's giving as an act of personal humility and dignity. So Gamal, it's an unusual word. Usually it's in the context of Gemilut Chasadim. It's unusual for it to be standing alone. For you saved my soul from death, my eye from a tear, my foot from stumbling. I walk before Adonai in the land of the living. Now the word et halech also echoes covenant in the following way. Genesis 17:1, where God gives Abram the invitation to enter into covenant with circumcision. God will say to Abraham, Ani El, I am God, het halech lefanai, walk before me, v'haya tamim, and you will be whole, you will be of integrity, you will be perfect. Ve'etna briti beini uveinecha, and I will give my covenant between me and between you. So here, verse 9, there's this echo of relationship that is already back to the time of Abraham. I believed, for I spoke, I am afflicted greatly. I said in my rashness, each mortal is deceitful. Kol hadam kozev. But this word chavzi, rashness, can be in my haste. Bechipazon, we left Egypt, bechipazon, in haste, same root word. And here the rabbis, of course, will wonder, what is this referring to? Abravanel, the great commentator of Spain, Portugal, he will say this refers to exile, in which our neighbors dealt with us so poorly. Rashi will say this is reference to one. Verse 12, that's where we would pick up today. There is a beautiful melody that Amy Robinson Katz chants. How can I repay you? And she does it in Hebrew and in English, beginning with verse 12, which the great writer Voltaire said was his favorite line of the Bible. What can I return back to Adonai? And again, there too, there's like a pause. All God's generosity to me. In my introduction, I shared how this was also these are the words in Latin for the city of Belfast, Ireland. How can I repay you for all your goodness to me? And this is where, with words of praise, verses 12 to 19, the psalmist now shifts into public declaration of God's goodness, as if, having been saved from some kind of danger, he now has a need to publicly proclaim God's love and God's goodness. And in verse 13, it's as if he's raising a cup to God, which can have two possibilities. One, when you would bring an offering of todah, an offering of thanksgiving for having been saved by danger in the time of the temple, it would also be included with a glass, with also wine being offered. Though Adin Steinsaltz will say, which is the other possibility, that it's lifting a cup of toast to God, not necessarily in the temple. Either is possible. It is part of what we say every Saturday night traditionally with Havdalah. We lift our cup and we say, Kos Yeshuot Hashem Adonai Ekra. The cup of deliverance I will lift up, in the name of Adonai I will call up. And so, one more comment. This is the cup of deliverances, technically, because Yeshuot is in the plural. Many dangers, or Samson Raphael Hirsch would say, many ways in which God has delivered us. And I'm pulling up the text again, as we're now moving toward the last verses of praise. My vows to Adonai will complete in the presence surely of God's people. When I was ill or endangered, I pledged to God that if I would recover, I would bring to the temple. I will not only do so, I will do so in witness, in testimony before others. Verse 15, precious in the eyes of Adonai is the death of God's pious ones. Rashi in Ibn Ezra will understand yakar as not precious but difficult, which is to say, my death, God, would have been painful to you. Please, Adonai, for I am your servant. I am your servant, the son of your handmaid. You have opened my straps. And the straps, often translated as bonds, it's a rare word. It only occurs 3 times in the Bible, twice in Isaiah and once here. These are the straps of the yoke, of the being or carrying a burden, like the straps that one has tied on a donkey are Mosarai. You have opened my straps back to freeing this person from the danger. I am your servant. To you I will offer a sacrifice of thanksgiving, and upon the name of Adonai I will call out. My vows to Adonai will complete in the presence, surely, of all God's people. And the word na, here translated as surely, is for emphasis. It can mean please. In the courtyards of the house of Adonai, in your midst of Jerusalem, hallelujah. So the end of this psalm is one of public declaration. I will go to Jerusalem, and there I will fulfill what I promised if you would save me, my vows. I will proclaim publicly your goodness to me. And so Psalm 116, a psalm of celebration of an individual saved who honors his own salvation by seeing himself dutifully as reliant on God. Only God is ultimately trustworthy, and the relationship to God is both that of etalech, like with Abraham, I will be in covenant, and I will be your servant. In contrast to the psalm of being redeemed from Egypt or having been idolaters, I will be your servant, God, and thereby be truly free. All right, with that, I invite some of your reactions, questions, before our honoree, Susie Herrera, shares a few words. Any comments or reactions today? Jack Pariser, so nice to see you back after missing you for a few days. And so many, now that I'm looking at the screen, I'm delighted to see so many of you. Any comments or reactions to these personal words of liberation? Ahuva, please unmute and share.
I have a few things to say. First of all, that this psalm cannot be written by David because of the last verse. It talks about the temple.
This is true too. That's
So
right. You didn't have to rely on Aramaic.
No. Another thing is the verse 13. Shavuot is this my father used to say to open the Kiddush every Shabbat. Today in the synagogue, we don't do that. I don't know why, but this is how maybe it's a Yemenite tradition, I don't know. But this is the opening of the Kiddush. The third remark is considered concerning verse 1. As you correctly said that past and present, they interchange. So when it says ahavti, I loved, it's really I love. It's present tense. However, the word ki does not function here as a reason because, but as when. I love when God listens to me. And then koli is not my voice, but it's the extension of the word by the yud, the suffix. It's a suffix that we can see it in other places like betochechi and all these poetic way of writing song. Alaichi, menuchaichi, it's the same thing. So it's not koli, my voice, but it's the sound. The sound. I love when God listens to me. I love when God listens to the voice of my pleas. kol tachanunai. That's all what I have to say.
Well, you said a lot of things that were valuable. Let me just emphasize a couple and then build on it. One, I love your description, Ahuva, of your father's table, where verse 13 is said before Kiddush on Friday night. And that's because of the reference. The cup of deliverance I will lift up, in the name of Adonai I will call out. A line of Psalms giving context to Kiddush, and perhaps, probably, a Yemenite custom, which is so rich in its Jewish observances, taking verse 13. I will add, in that regard, still staying focused on that image, of a description in the Talmud of how this verse is used as a proof text. Rabbah, 3rd century Babylonia, will say, where do we learn that we should thank God for both the good and the bad in our lives? And Rabbi Tanchum answers, we learn it from Psalm 116, the combination of verse 13, raising our cup in gratitude, and then pointing to verses 3 and 4. For God hears us when we are encircled by death, meaning we thank God even in bad times and in good times. So at least that's how the Talmud also uses this image of gratitude, of raising our cups and toast, and dangers of verses 3 and 4. In terms of the comment that Ahuva made, back to the challenge of translation and verse 1, ki is normally used as for or because. That's how most of the translations deal with it. And therefore, in verse 1, see it as a gap, meaning I love, pause, for Adonai hears my voice. But as Ahuva says, ki can also be understood as when. So I love when Adonai hears my voice, which again is the way that Beit Hillel understands it in Rosh Hashanah in the Talmud 17a. So, that's again the nature of the challenge of translation. And more than that, that is the nature of poetry, creating ambiguity to allow for both to be simultaneously true. There was other reactions to Psalm 116. Jack Pariser, if you can unmute, have you learned to? All right, so you're going to have to find out how to unmute. We'll hold off, Jack, but when you do, anybody else? Hunter, please. Go ahead, Hunter.
My conclusion or my mega issue from this psalm, I think, is if God has everything, how can we pay God back? And applying God's teachings or what we got from God in our life and bringing him into focus is really, I think, my main issue from it. And applying our soul, which I think is also part of why we're taking these psalms and why we go to synagogue and why we carry out the practices that we do in Judaism. So
I want to even just pull this up for a second, because Hunter is bringing our attention to this very important verse, verse 12. Ma ashiv la Adonai, what can I return or repay to Adonai? Called tagmulohi alai, and here I put a dash, but which often gets filled in as for all God's generosity to me. I did a dash because I like the quality of gushing, and therefore, it's not linear. There's kind of this pause. And as Hunter emphasizes, that verse 12, which is toward the center of this psalm, is in the context of, if God is the creator who has given me all the bounty of life, who has moreover paid attention to my pleas, which is when I feel loved, and more, saved me. How can we possibly give anything back to God? God has everything. But as we saw last week with Psalm 115, the one thing God wants and needs seems to be our love and our praise, which is the trajectory here. I will offer thanksgiving. I will do so in the presence of others, and the line of walking in the land of the living. In contrast to the dead, I will be in verse 9. I will walk before Adonai in the land of the living, which is to say, not only will I survive, but I will be one who will praise God. That's why precious in the eyes of Adonai is the death of God's pious ones, because what God needs is our love. And so that's back to Hunter, verse 12. What can I return to Adonai? All God's generosity to me, which then opens up the rest of the psalm, which is praising God and doing so in public. One last comment, and then a word from our honoree, from Susie. Richard Henley, thank you. Go ahead, Richard.
Okay, yeah. Just on a personal basis, verse 5, the idea that you brought up that Hanun balanced with Sadiq gives us Rachim, and the graciousness and justice is when they're balanced out, comes out with to compassion. And anyway, I just personally appreciated that.
Oh, thank you, Richard. That again is how the Sefirot, the mystical understanding of God's DNA, is structured. In pulling my attention to verse 5, Chanun Adonai v'tzadik, gracious is Adonai and just and righteous. Ve'eloheinu, our God, mirachem, is compassionate. And I will point out that the word, this is one of the words for God, rachamana, rachem. It's also used, by the way, in Arabic as a description for Allah. The root of mirachem is womb. In that sense, there is this quality of motherly love, that ultimately I trust that God will see me as an extension of God, the way a child is an extension of that which comes from the mother. So that's another dimension of the expression of closeness that the psalmist has with God. And it is also echoing God's self-description to Moses in the context of having forgiven the Israelites for the golden calf. That quality of choosing to forgive. And here, to pull this together, this is a deeply personal psalm that comes after the national psalms. Almost as if, we pray to God communally and then get our own voice. Or we translate the we into our own experience as an I of liberation, making Psalm 116 part of the package of those psalms chosen, 113 to 118, that are used for Pesach and used in holidays
I'll be there in a second. Okay,
to express God's love for us and our love for God. Our honoree, Susie Levin Herrera, a closing word about the study of Psalms.
I think the piece about gratitude throughout all of the Psalms and generosity is probably what resonated the most to me, as well as community. As you know, I've been dropping in and out because I'm still working. Whenever I have this hour free, I like to drop in.
It, for me, who's quarantined on my own until I got vaccinated, this was my community in a lot of ways. And I really appreciate, even though I know very few of you, it's been wonderful for me. So thank you, Julia. So, I mean, I just think that what's meaningful to me, and this is a great type of learning because it does allow for you to drop in and drop out. You don't need a lot of the historical perspective of the other Psalms. But, in addition to seeing my community, it's also given me the opportunity to say Kaddish for my mother, which I probably would not have been able to do were we not on Zoom, as well as my siblings joined one day and we said Kaddish for our shared father. So that was really important. So mostly I just like to thank all of you. It's been comforting to join you. And of course I enjoy the learning, but the sense of community has been really valuable to me and really important. So thank you all. And thank you for this honor, Rabbi.
You're welcome, Susie. And I will come full circle in terms of linking your thoughtful words with this psalm. This psalm's trajectory is from the I to wishing and being in community, and that being how we connect ourselves more fully to ourselves and to God. So thank you, Susie.